Good morning. It is April 8th, 2020, and I am recording a presentation on the Italian plague of 1630, and in particular about a novel that places the plague at the center of its narrative. The title of the novel is The Betrothed, or I Promessi Sposi in Italian. My name is Graziella Parati. I'm the Paul D. Paganucci Professor of Italian Literature and Language at Dartmouth College. Let me start by sharing my screen with you so you can follow my presentation through the slides that I have prepared for this talk. We're talking about a plague that took place between 1629 and 1633, and I will deal with it in detail. But first of all, let me talk about the author of this novel, whose name is Alessandro Manzoni, born at the very end of the 18th century. Wrote this novel, The Betrothed, at the beginning called The Fermo and Lucia, the two characters in the novel, and published in a certain number of volumes at the beginning of the 20th century, I think in the 1820s. This novel plays a big role when we talk about Italy as a political entity. It is a novel written in a new language, then became the standard language of Italian, or anyway, the literary language, and created the basis of what we call Italian literature of the unification. That is, when we think of Italy at the beginning of the 19th century, but actually for the first half of the 19th century, sorry, we're thinking of an area that is sort of a colonial space under the influence of many other powers. In the north of Italy, Austria dominates, and the first half of the 19th century is a time of revolutions, protests, of the declaration of a desire to change the situation. And as we all know, the 19th century is the century of nation formation. Let's remember Germany, for example. Italy is definitely a country that forms itself as the modern Italy we think of right now, forms itself gradually in the 19th century. Alessandro Manzoni is an intellectual born in the north of Italy with an education that is from mainly religious institutions, but it's also an international education. His first language is pretty much French, as it is for a lot of the intellectuals at the time. He even married a woman from Geneva, Calvinist, who turned Catholic, and he pens this novel, which certainly does not deal with the situation of Italy in the 19th century. Of course, censorship is very strong. One cannot express feelings that have sympathies for this sort of ideal unification or potential unification of a political entity that could be Italy. He writes a novel about the 17th century. Then in the 17th century, the Spaniards occupied the north of Italy. So it creates a parallel between the Austrians dominating in northern Italy in the 19th century and the Spaniards being in Italy in the 17th century. The novel is called I Promessi Sposi. It starts out as a soap opera, practically. This book is a soap opera with a plague, plus a lot of criticism towards the established order of things. Don't get me wrong, Manzoni is not a revolutionary himself. He's sort of a reformist with sympathies toward the movements of the time, and certainly became a beacon of the desires, as I said before, of unification of Italy. Sort of like Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi's last name was taken as an acronym for Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia, Victor Emmanuel, King of Italy. So in a way to support the idea that the king of Piedmont at the time could become the king of Italy and unify. And that's exactly what happens very quickly. We have first wars with the Austrians in 59. There were others, but failed. 59, 60, you have the first unification of Italy. In 66, you have another chunk of northern Italy becomes part of Italy. And then in 1870, you have the occupation of the Pope states. And then if you want, we could think of World War I as the last war of unification for Italy. So let's go back to Alessandro Manzoni. I have to warn you, this is a rather informal presentation. So it's not written, I'm just talking to you. But let's go back to the Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi. The final version came out in 1840. And my second slide will show you a picture of an early edition of the Betrothed. What you see here is the incipit, the beginning of the novel. Here is Don Abbondio, who's a rather corrupt and unreliable priest who's supposed a day later to celebrate a wedding, but he encounters these two ruffians. The ruffians are sent by a very bad guy, Don Rodrigo, who's infatuated with Lucia, main character, and doesn't want the wedding to take place. And here is a really interesting representations of the ruffians with Don Abbondio. Don Abbondio is rather a coward. He represents an institution that sometimes, of course, bends according to the wills of the most powerful in the area. But I thought you would enjoy seeing the way that this narratives is represented. As I said, it is a soap opera in a way, because there will be the bad guys, and there will be the two young people in love, and the bad guys will prevent the wedding from taking place. And then there will be, of course, other more nuanced characters in the narrative. However, as I'm just talking freely to you, I would like to go to an aside at this point. That is, when in 1840 the novel came out, Alessandro Manzoni cut out a piece of the former version that had been published in the 1820s. And it is a section that then he will publish and call La Colonna Infame, the infamous column. And it is an episode that introduces very clearly what happened in the city of Milano or Milan during the plague. And let me go there. La storia della colonna infame, published, as I said, in 1840, is the story of two people who were considered guilty of spreading the plague in 1630. They were captured by the crowd, and they were sentenced to death in the cruelest possible way possible and imaginable, which was to be crushed by a wheel and then tied to the wheel and later burned, hopefully keeping the people alive as long as possible. What you have here is a representation of the Storia della Colonna Infame, that is the story itself. What you see is the title, and then you literally see the column, the infamous column that was erected in the place where one of the people who were killed, who were executed, had his home. It was a barber. And the house was destroyed, everything he owned was burned, and in its place, they erected a column. You cannot see it now. I mean, we know exactly where the house was. There's, of course, a more modern house now. It was in the area of Via Torino in Milano, not far from the Colonne di San Lorenzo. So here is a representation of what remains after this terrible punishment of this person. So why would 2 people be selected, and they were not the only one, and sentenced as being guilty of spreading the plague of 1629, 1630. Let me just read a little excerpt from the novel itself. A dispatch signed by King Philip IV had reached the governor the year before. We're talking about the governor that was in Milano, warning him the 4 Frenchmen had escaped from Madrid, who were wanted there on suspicion of having used poisonous unguents to spread the plague. The governor was instructed to be on alert in case they appeared in Milan. He communicated the dispatch to the Senate. Now that the plague had broken out and being recognized as such, memories of the message may have reinforced certain vague suspicions that monstrous treachery was at work, and then foreigners were suspect. So this process of scapegoating really took place during the plague, and these 2 people were considered guilty of being anointers. That is, people who would create combinations of substances in their homes, and then they would go around and spread it on people's doors, and with it they would spread the plague. Of course, this was absolutely ridiculous, but people certainly believed that somebody had to be guilty of spreading the plague. So Orhan Pamuk very recently in an article in the New York Times talked about Manzoni's sympathies for the ordinary people who, because of the bad choices of the rulers who didn't stop the plague early enough, and this all sounds very familiar right now. So Pamuk says Manzoni had a lot of sympathy for the people. Well, yes and no, because Manzoni is very good at describing the craziness, the panic, and the anxiety that led people to literally kill similar people, making them artificially guilty of spreading the plague. And here we have another representation of the location where the house of the anointer, always in quotation marks, was located, and to look at what kind of pain they had to go through. I want to show you this slide, and in the slide you see the punishment for the anointers, the people who were considered guilty of spreading the plague. And you see the infamous wheel on which the people were literally impaled and then burned. And you see a body hanging from a foot being burned, and you see other punishments here. And of course, all of this also happened without the church intervening to stop the slaughter, but actually, as it is at an institution at the time, finding guilty people to execute would be a way to also take away the guilt that laid on the shoulders of the people in power who did very little. So let me move on to, I think, another quotation from the novel. The madness propagated itself as fast as the plague. Any traveler who was found by the peasants off the main road, or who loitered on the road to look around, or who lay down for a rest, any unknown person with anything strange or suspicious about his face or clothing was an anointer. And the punishment for that, as I said, was terrible. Let me show you another picture, another example of the punishment that they had to go through, of course, being completely innocent of the charge. What you also see in the slide is people gathering in order to witness the execution of the anointers. And you do know that if you have people gathering during a pandemic, like the bubonic plague of 1629, 1633, this is a disaster. This is a way to propagate. And in that way, the plague would easily spread to a larger number of people. But unfortunately, even the church had processions had religious ceremonies in order to stop the plague that would bring people together and therefore allow the plague to spread. So here are the people who were killed in 1630. Guglielmo Piazza, which was a commissario di sanità, that is a health commissioner, and the commissioners were officials who would coordinate the service of the Monati, of whom I will talk about later on. And then the second person was Giacomo Mora, who was killed, the Barbiere, whose house was destroyed. And of course, you know, the barbers were not just barbers as we intend them now, as we understand now. They were also surgeons. There were people who would extract teeth, for example, or lance wounds, infected wounds, and so on and so forth. So I know I have put aside the romantic narrative of Renzo and Lucia, but we really need to talk about this important plague. And why did the plague spread in 1629, 1630? Starting from the 16th century, we already are in the 17th century, Italy loses very quickly its sort of local independence, and more powers come down into Italy and conquer parts of Italy and occupy them. We know that in 1527, Rome is sacked. We know that in 1576, we already have a plague. It is the plague of St. Charles, well known. And Setala, who is a doctor during that plague, is still alive for the plague of 1629, 1633. But why exactly in 1629 we have the beginning of this pandemic in northern, it started in northern Italy, but it also will concern Switzerland, will concern other areas. What you see here is an image of a Landsknecht. That is mercenaries that are coming down into Italy to fight particular wars. In Lombardy, where Milan is located, where the plague really, like it is happening now, like with the new pandemic, is really killing large number of people, is going to a war. Mantua loses his last Gonzaga duke, and therefore a lot is going on. Landsknecht are mercenaries. They are soldiers coming from the north, being used in these wars. And here in the picture, you have also an image of a woman. Usually the Landsknecht could travel with wives who will be in charge, that will take care of feeding the soldiers themselves. And they are recognizable because they're always wearing the sword and that longer lance. I don't know how to call it. I'm not very good with armor, with describing armor. So you have soldiers living in questionable hygienic conditions, and hygiene was not a priority to start with anywhere in Europe. And then you have them traveling around. So the spreading of the disease happens very quickly. It started outside the city of Milano in areas of Lecco, Como, exactly where the story of Manzoni's The Betrothed will take place, and then it will spread further on. By the way, I don't know if you're hearing this, but there are a lot of sirens out there. And it's kind of appropriate to have this as a score of this presentation. I'm in New York, so there are a lot of ambulances going by. So talking about the plague and hearing sirens makes quite a bit of sense. So when Manzoni decides to write about this plague, he laments the fact that there is not much narrated about it. There is a historian, Giuseppe Ripamonti, who really spends a lot of time talking about this. So Manzoni thinks of himself as, yes, a novelist that will create a historical novel, but also as a historian that will delve into what happened during that time. And the plague is described as sort of symptomatic of a period of oppression, whether it is the oppression of the Spaniards in Italy in the 17th century, or whether it is the oppression of the Austrians in Italy later on. Thank God we have a certain number of representations of the plague that is quite interesting. Here we have Piazza San Babila in Milano. Not far from here, there would be that Porta Orientale, that oriental door through which people think the first people infected with the plague will come through and then move into the city. And you see this as a print of Piazza San Babila during the plague, and you see the chaos that is right there. Okay, now it's time to go back to the soap opera, to the love story. Here you have the Betrothed. Here you have a representation in painting in the 19th century, of course, of Lucia and Renzo. Lucia is the kind of character that a teenager like me who read The Betrothed for the first time really despised. She's a very passive, sort of an idea of femininity that is very subdued. She's very shy. And I remember rolling my eyes when I read it. And we do need to read this novel as teenagers as fundamental part of the canon, because it's so important in the formation of the language and also of an idea, a modern idea of Italy. So here you see Lucia, and then you see Renzo on the other side, sort of this contrasted love. And the two characters are sort of humble people. Renzo is actually not the poorest of the poor. Renzo is a silk spinner, and therefore he has some sort of a specialized job that allows him to have enough money to consider marrying Lucia. Lucia is, you know, she's a good girl. She will end up working as a servant. Of course, we're talking about illiterate people, and they're sort of moved by history. It's history that moves them. There's not a lot of agency on their part, because, you know, it's also very true that humble people had very rarely the possibility, changing the social conditions they were born in, and also in really making decisions about their destiny. So let's go to another picture, slide, and here you see again Don Abbondio and the two ruffians that work for Don Rodrigo. And Don Rodrigo, you can tell by the name, is a Spaniard, represents Spanish power within northern Italy. These two lovers have inspired a lot of art, and we have had enormous editions of the Promessi Sposi. This is, I thought, a very interesting and certainly more modern representations from the one that we saw at the beginning, done in the 19th century. On the one hand, you see Don Rodrigo. You see that he's evil. He has quite, you know, the evil eyes right there. And then Lucia, who's the coveted woman, right there. Renzo is very often portrayed like this, and sometimes he's portrayed as blonde. Of course, this story takes place in northern Italy, so there is this vague idea that there are more blonde people over there, but you also see the representation of contemporary costumes. And then another important character is the innominato, the unnamed. This is another representative of Spanish power, who's quite evil. He's a friend of Don Rodrigo, and even more powerful than Don Rodrigo. And he promises to keep Lucia. Lucia is kidnapped by Don Rodrigo, by his ruffians, and then taken to the unnamed castle to keep her there until Don Rodrigo can pick her up and therefore do whatever, you know, evil things he thinks to do to her. The innominato, however, goes through a very troubled night and changes his mind. So there's sort of an epiphany for him that turns him into a positive characters, and therefore, instead of handing Lucia over, he protects her. So as I said at the beginning, Alessandro Manzoni was raised in religious institutions. His mother had left his father and had a relationship with another man. So Alessandro Manzoni was boarded at his institution. So he was very connected with Catholicism. And this book is very much a product of his religious beliefs with a twist. He puts in the novel a lot of negative religious figures. Donabondio, for example, there will be also the infamous episode of Suor Gertrude, the nun who is put in a convent in order to save money from the family who doesn't want to pay for a dowry. That was the destiny of a lot of aristocratic women, by the way, also Manzoni's daughter. We're not going to go there. Suor Gertrude ends up behaving in a way that is not right for a nun, or what is expected of a nun, and will end up being walled alive in the convent where she sinned. And there are some historical bases for this. But here we are, the Innominato sort of converts. And there is in Manzoni's novel an idea of the divine providence, of this intervention over people's lives that also will guarantee a happy ending for this novel. I hope I'm not spoiling it for you. But in the case of the Innominato, we really have a conversion that will turn him from a very negative character into a rather positive one. All these people all these characters will be affected by the plague. Renzo will, Lucia will, Don Rodrigo will die in miserable conditions because of the plague, abandoned by his ruffians, and in particular by the closest one, who is Il Griso, who then will die of the plague as well. So in this sense, you also see divine providence intervening. The novel is a rather interesting, as I said, love story, and with a ton of characters. If you're interested in reading about the plague, you have to go to chapter 31, from 31 to 35. Yes, it is a rather thick volume. But let's go to chapter 31 and look at how Manzoni, who wants to be a historian and at the same time is a novelist, will portray how people behave during the plague. And here we go. And they seem to us like so many savages, one with a sprig of mint in his hand, one with rue, and one with rosemary, and another with a flask of vinegar. You have somehow to smile, because that's a conversation we had when our pandemic started, right? What are we going to use in order to protect us? What happens in Milano is that the governor sends Tadino, who's a special envoy, outside of the city to look at what's happening and how people are behaving and what they are doing. And what he encounters is all the local people believing in concoctions, very different concoctions. And please feel free to smile, because vinegar is also one thing that was mentioned that could protect us from the contemporary COVID-19 virus. So the plague starts spreading, the governor does very little, and people are also weakened by famine. And here is what Manzoni says in moments of the novel. The famine of the previous year, 1628, the cruelties inflicted by the soldiers, and the general distress of mind that follow these things seem to everybody to be more than enough for the deaths. So yes, a plague is spreading, and people are saying, oh no, these are vapors from the marshes. It's not the plague. We have already suffered so much. No, it cannot be another plague. There is memory of the 1576 plague, of course. So there is a little sense of urgency, and our Manzoni says that. and I'm sorry for the typo that you see coming up. All tenants in the house were moved to the lazzaretto. Several of them died shortly afterwards, and there could be no doubt that their trouble had been an infectious one. This is the first recorded case of a soldier visiting his family in the city of Milano, falling sick and dying clearly of the plague. The house is burned down, but already the plague was spreading. We are at the end of 1629, and then the beginning of 1630. So we also have a lot of doctors who decide not to endorse the idea that there is a plague going on, and they refuse that, and they embrace with the people the idea that it is just vapors, that is malaria, that is affecting the people. And here is just to also give you an idea of Manzoni's style. This is what he says. Many doctors echoing the voice of the people, but hardly in this case the voice of God. So Manzoni is not somebody who buys completely into the institution of the church and what the church says. He will always talk a little bit about divine providence and what comes directly from God. So the doctors ridicule the sinister prophecies and gloomy warnings of the minority. So I hope I'm not boring you with these quotations, but I hope that it will make you feel like going to the novel and really reading the novel itself. So the people who are actually telling the truth of what is spreading or what is happening, I really hate it. And Manzoni says the main odium fell on two doctors, Tadino, we have already encountered it as an envoy, and then Senator Settala, the son of the chief physician. And Settala is an important name because he is the doctor who was there in 1576 when the plague of St. Charles spread in northern Italy. So, and he reached, we're talking about the odium, the point where they could not cross the squares of the city without being assailed with curses or even stones, right? There's sort of these Cassandras that people don't want to believe. They saw a terrible catastrophe coming nearer and nearer and did everything they could to avert it. And at the same time, encountered obstacles where they looked for help, became the butt of popular indignation, and were regarded as enemies of the country. Which is, again, an accusation that people thought anointers were guilty of. People who were betraying the city of Milano. You are an anointer, you are betraying the city. So you are traitors to the city itself. You are traitors to the other people. And that contributed to them being sentenced to death. And let's move on. Let's see if we can go to the next slide here. And here is another example how people refuse to believe that there was certainly something bad happening. And they christened it, this is sort of a malignant vapors from the marches, the malign fever or the pestilent fever, a wretched evasion. In fact, a mere fraudulent play of words. It still concealed the fact that the disease was transmitted by contact. So here is Manzoni, the novelist, doing something very interesting for us, telling us that words can reveal the truth, as he's doing in his historical narrative, but they can also manipulate it and used in order to escape from the truth. Let's move on. And once people realized that the plague was spreading, I mean, it lasted for almost 4 years. So you can imagine at some point people have to believe it. What do they do? So the governor of the city organized an area of the city that was called Lazzaretto. And you see the name also in the English translation if you are using the Penguin translation of the Betrothed. And the Lazzaretto is a very particular name. It could come from Lazarus, that is in the Gospel by St. John, the man who Jesus resurrected from the death. So, you know, sort of a good omen for what would happen to the people put in the lazzaretto. Or it could be a sort of a distortion of the name of an island off the coast of Venice, St. Mary of Nazareth. So that from Nazareth became from Lazareth, Lazzaretto, where people who came back with diseases from the Holy Land on pilgrimages, that's where they were kept before being allowed within the city of Venice. So anyway, a name that is connected to death and to disease. It was a Lazzaretto was a very large area. So they had a square middle with porches. You could sort of walk around. And then it had about 230 cells where people theoretically would be recovered. Very quickly, however, that structure transforms into this. Total chaos of people who are, there are sick people there, there are recovering people, because some people do survive the plague, and then there are people who are quarantined there. So you can imagine the mess, and also the governor does not really organize the place. What he will do, it will give the running of the plague to the Capuchins. The Capuchins are an order of friars. They are Franciscans. It comes from a reformed group of Franciscans from the 16th century, totally approved by the church, of course. And they will be the ones who will devote their lives, literally, to taking care of the people afflicted by the plague. The man in charge is a friar, Felice Casati, who will bring other brothers to work in the Lazzaretto. And you see here the representation of the people who are sick and the friars that are taking care of them. So this is a description by Manzoni of what Father Felice Casati did. He dried the tears of others and shed tears of his own. He caught the plague at the beginning of his ministry, recovered from it, and went back to his duties with renewed vigor. I mean, what can I say about this? I mean, the people in power try to hand over the duty to take care of sick people to somebody else. And here Manzoni says he's very critical of the authority. Those in possession of such vital authority, that is the governor, could think of nothing better to do than to hand it over to someone else. Don't get me wrong, there will be doctors going there, but of course doctors at some point, and a lot of them refuse to go into the Lazzaretto because being afraid of being infected by the plague. At one point, according to Ripamonti history, there are about 50,000 people in the Lazzaretto. So you can imagine the chaos, the desperation, and above all, the lack of care. It's sort of a really disastrous situation, no doubt. When Renzo goes to the Lazzaretto to try and find Lucia, who, by the way, also had the plague, Manzoni says at that point there are about 16,000 people in that particular area. So who takes these sick people to the Lazzaretto? Well, they are the Monatti. The Monatti is sort of an untranslatable word into English. They are usually criminals. You are in jail, maybe even sentenced to death, and they give you this opportunity to say, okay, you are freed if then you serve by collecting the dead and taking them to either the Lazzaretto or to a huge grave that was dug out right outside the Lazzaretto. And sometimes in Milano, when they do construction work, they still end up finding the bones of the bodies, the people who died of the plague of 1630, 33, 29, 33. And here is a representation of the Monatti. And the Monatti also, a lot of them died because of the plague, but they thought that sometimes this was a good alternative to the life that they were living in jail or, again, waiting for execution. And above all, very often they would remove valuable from the bodies, because you have to imagine sometimes people literally drop dead in the street, and there would be these Monatti who would walk by and pick up the bodies. So here is the description that Manzoni gives us of the Monatti. The Monatti were employed on the most unpleasant and dangerous of the duties arising from the plague. They collected corpses from houses and streets and from the Lazzaretto, carted them to graveyards and buried them, sorry, that's a big typo. They carried or led the sick to the Lazzaretto and kept them in order. So there would be this cart with the Monatti picking up, and in front of them, there would be the apparitori. The special task of the apparitori was to walk in front of the carts, ringing a bell to warn passers-by to keep out of the way. So it was really interesting from a literary point of view, because it's a description that gives us the performance of the collection of the bodies, of what people would really see in their daily lives. And Manzoni gives us also a very moving description of a mother who has to hand over the body of a child to a monatto to be taken, to be buried, because the child is dead. And I have read this novel maybe 50 times because I've taught it so many times. And every time it is impossible not to tear up. So you probably will feel exactly the same. A loathsome monatto went up to take the child from its mother's arms, though his bearing showed an unusual degree of respect and an involuntary hesitation, another type of forgive me. No, she said, you must not touch her yet. I must put her on the cart with my own hands. Here, take this, other type. When you come back this way tonight, you must come in and take me away too, and not me alone. And then Manzoni shows the mother appearing at the window and with another child in her hand, and they are waiting for death, and the Monatti will come and pick them up. And here you see in this representation, which is a 19th century painting, handing over a bag of money to the Monatto. And here you see another thing about the play, right? That it started to spread from the soldiers to more humble people, but quickly went through the social classes, and even the wealthier people were infected by it and suddenly died of it. Here is another representation of the Monatti. It's a truly infernal representation of the relationship that, because of the plagues, established between people and death, people and bodies, people and the removal of those bodies, and how those bodies were treated, sort of thrown into common graves. And here is a much more contemporary representation of the grave, the huge grave dug near the Lazzaretto. And here is what Manzoni says. Near the Lazzaretto, a large communal grave had been dug, but only one. When it was full of bodies, the corpses of the newly dead began to remain unburied. Not only in the Lazzaretto, but everywhere in the city. And there were more of them every day than the day before. Talk about this sort of infernal transformation of the city of Milano from a seat of power and of wealth in a certain way into this disastrous context. So let's go back, however, to the Lazzaretto, to this sort of structure that potentially could have kept some of the most serious cases away from the city, although it is very close to the city. It is in the city almost. It's really very close to the Porta Orientale. And it doesn't exist anymore, by the way. You cannot go find it, but I will show you something at the end. So here is what Manzoni says about this lazzaretto. Now the reader must imagine the enclosure of the lazzaretto with a population of 6,000 sufferers from the plague. This is what Renzo sees when he goes to the lazzaretto to look for Lucia. The whole internal space crammed with sheds and huntments, with carts and with people. Those two endless colonnades on either side, full and overflowing with the desperately sick and the dead, lying together without distinction on palliaces or on base straw. Throughout the vast compound, a stir, a movement, a sort of undulation could be seen. Here and there, people came and went, stopped or sped up, bent over patients or straightened up again. Those moving figures might be convalescents or lunatics or attendants. Of course, the toll on the psyche and the balance, psychological balance of people was terrifying at the time. Such was the sight that suddenly filled Renzo's field of vision. Oh gosh, my spelling is terrible. And kept him standing there amazed and overwhelmed. Can you imagine this man walking into the lazzaretto, hoping to find his beloved, and then what he sees in front of him is this terrifying view of dying and dead bodies. Does Renzo find Lucia? Yep, they do. There is a happy ending, so I hope I'm not spoiling the whole thing, but there has to be a happy ending. The Betrothed is a novel in which, thanks to the intervention of the Providence, the Holy Providence, things have to turn out somehow well. It is also a novel that is a good wish for what the future of Italy and unification could be, sort of overcoming a lot of difficulties. And here we go, we have Renzo finding Lucia. And by the way, this is probably the most boring part of the novel, sort of predictable. It's not particularly interesting, but hey, you know, we take happy endings wherever they come from. And here you see in this print representation of Lucia, who had the plague, recovered, and is taking care of somebody else who is sick. And you see the surprise of Renzo in finding her still healthy. So I would say that the plague is probably one of the most important characters in the novel itself, and the lazzaretto, with what happens within its walls, is incredibly interesting to also learn about society at the time and how the established powers really did not take care of this emergency at that time. So when Manzoni was writing, the lazzaretto still existed. And here is a photo, a very unusual photo of the lazzaretto, what it looked like in the 19th century. So a couple of centuries, one more, 250 years after the plague of 1629, 1633. And you still see the structure. You have that enormous area in the middle, and then cells on the side, and then the porches that were running. What you see also in a particular corner on the right is a church. And the church, I have to say, still exists. That's the only thing that still exists, is now the church of San Carlo, and here it is. And it's surrounded by contemporary buildings. Of course, it's been changed a number of times. Before, you had the entrances on every side of the church, but it's still there. It still exists right here. And in the Betrothed, you have Renzo that meets with a good friar, Fra Cristoforo, who tells him where to find Lucia within the lazzaretto itself. So there is, even in the novel, the apparition of this church described by Manzoni himself. So here it is. Here is the description that Manzoni gives us. The octagonal chapel stands in the middle of the Lazaretto on a platform reached by a short flight of steps. When it was originally constructed, it was open on all 8 sides. So I hope that my presentation has given you an idea of what that plague was, how it was represented in a novel that is important for a process of national unification. And we are talking about it 390 years, almost to the day, when the plague started in Milano. So thank you for listening to me, and stay safe. Thank you.